The morning began like any other in the quiet suburban town of Arbor Creek. It was a Saturday, the kind of day where children roamed free on their bikes, played in backyards, and explored the edges of the nearby forest. The streets were lined with maple trees shedding their vibrant autumn leaves, painting the sidewalks in hues of gold, red, and orange. Birds chirped lazily from the rooftops, and there was a soft hum of lawnmowers in the distance. To any onlooker, it was a perfect day, uneventful, peaceful, and safe. For Daniel, a 12-year-old boy with a curious mind and boundless energy, it was another opportunity for adventure. His Saturdays were almost always spent outdoors, his trusty bike never far from his side. Daniel wasn't like the other kids who spent their weekends glued to video games or watching TV. He loved the fresh air, the thrill of discovery, and the idea that something exciting was always just around the corner. Today, he planned to explore the old forest trail near his neighborhood, a place where he and his friends often played, though most of them stayed clear of it these days. The woods had an eerie reputation among the younger children in town. Whispers of strange sightings, mysterious noises, and the occasional missing pet kept most kids away. But not Daniel. To him, the woods were magical, a place filled with secret paths and hidden treasures. He had explored every inch of them, or so he thought. With the sun high in the sky and his mother's voice echoing in his ears, reminding him to be home for lunch, Daniel grabbed his bike and pedaled down the street, waving to a few neighbors on the way. The breeze whipped through his hair as he rode, his mind wandering to the endless possibilities of what he might discover today. After about 10 minutes of riding, Daniel reached the entrance to the woods. The towering trees cast long shadows over the path, but he wasn't intimidated. He parked his bike at the usual spot, near a large oak tree that marked the start of his personal playground. He smiled as he entered the woods, breathing in the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. As he ventured deeper into the forest, Daniel's pace slowed. He wasn't in a rush. After all, this was his sanctuary. The woods were quieter than usual, the sounds of the town fading into the distance. Daniel didn't mind the silence, though. It was peaceful, calming even. He loved the feeling of being completely alone, surrounded by nature. But as he walked, something strange began to tug at his senses. A distant sound, faint but unmistakable, broke the stillness. At first, Daniel thought it was an animal, maybe a deer rustling through the underbrush. He paused, straining his ears to catch the noise again. There it was, soft, almost like a cry. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a child. He stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to ignore it. After all, kids from the nearby neighborhood sometimes wandered into the woods to play, just like he did. But this sound was different. It wasn't playful laughter or the rustling of leaves. It was a cry, a muffled, desperate cry. His curiosity piqued. Daniel began moving toward the sound, his senses now on high alert. As he approached the noise, the trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker. His pulse quickened, and the serene calm of the woods now felt menacing. He crept forward, every step cautious, every breath shallow. The cries were becoming clearer now, frightened, panicked, and getting closer. Suddenly, through the dense trees, Daniel saw a figure. He froze. Ahead of him, partially hidden by the thick foliage, a man was dragging a young girl through the woods. She was small, no more than 6 or 7 years old, and she was struggling against him, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth was covered by the man's hand, stifling her screams. Daniel's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Time seemed to slow down as he processed the scene before him. His mind raced with a million thoughts. Should he run? Should he scream? Should he try to help her? Fear gripped him, rooting him to the spot. He had never faced anything like this before. This was no game, no childhood adventure. This was real, and it was terrifying. The man hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on subduing the girl, who was kicking and squirming in his grasp. Daniel knew he had only seconds to act before it was too late. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let this happen. Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing with possible scenarios. He had to do something, anything, to stop this man and save the girl. But how? He was just a kid, armed with nothing but a stick lying on the ground next to him. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his palms sweaty, his throat dry. His mind flashed to his parents. They had always told him to stay out of trouble, to never get involved in dangerous situations. But this wasn't about him. It was about the girl. She was in danger, and he couldn't just walk away. Without giving himself time to reconsider, Daniel clenched the stick tightly in his hand and stepped forward, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet louder than he had anticipated. The man's head snapped toward Daniel, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the boy. For a brief second, they locked eyes. Daniel felt a wave of fear wash over him, but he didn't back down. He couldn't. He had to be brave. He had to do something, anything, to stop this man and save the girl. "Let her go," Daniel shouted, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry through the trees. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. The man glared at him, tightening his grip on the girl as she whimpered. For a moment, Daniel thought he might come after him, and he braced himself for the worst. But something unexpected happened. The man hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder, as if weighing his options, before suddenly releasing the girl and bolting into the forest. The girl stumbled, falling to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Daniel rushed to her side, his heart still racing. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft now, trying to comfort her. She nodded, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel looked around, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. The man was gone, but the danger wasn't over. He knew they had to get out of the woods, and fast. "Come on," he said, helping the girl to her feet. "Let's get out of here." With the girl holding tightly to his hand, Daniel led her back toward the entrance of the woods, his heart still pounding. The peaceful, quiet day had turned into a nightmare, and nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel's legs were trembling as he and the little girl emerged from the dense cover of the woods. The sunlight stung his eyes after the dimness of the forest, and the familiar streets of his neighborhood looked strangely surreal, almost out of place. The girl beside him clung tightly to his hand, her small fingers cold and trembling. She was still crying softly, her breath hitching with each sob. It took every ounce of strength Daniel had not to cry too. His mind was racing. What should he do next? He knew he had to get help, but his own house was too far away, and his parents were out running errands. Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who lived just across the street from the woods, might be home. He remembered her warm smile and the stories she would tell him whenever he delivered her groceries. She was like a grandmother to all the kids in the neighborhood. And right now, he needed someone who could help them both. "Hey," Daniel whispered, kneeling down so he was eye level with the girl. She had messy brown hair tied in a ponytail, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. She looked utterly fragile and lost, like a little bird that had fallen out of its nest. "What's your name?" The girl sniffled and looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Lily," she stammered, barely audible. "Okay, Lily," Daniel said gently, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to go to Mrs. Turner's house, okay? She's a nice lady. She'll help us." Lily just nodded, still clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in her world. Daniel stood up, his hand never leaving hers, and together they began to walk across the empty street toward Mrs. Turner's house. Each step felt heavy, like walking through quicksand. His mind kept replaying the terrifying image of the man in the woods, his dark eyes boring into Daniel as he dragged Lily away. Who was he? What would have happened if Daniel hadn't been there? A shudder ran through him, but he pushed the thoughts away. There was no time for fear now. The small, tidy house that belonged to Mrs. Turner came into view. Daniel's heart leaped with relief when he saw her old green station wagon parked in the driveway. She was home. He quickened his pace, pulling Lily gently along, and ran up the short walkway to the front door. "Mrs. Turner," he called, banging on the door with his free hand. "Mrs. Turner, it's Daniel. I need help." There was a long, agonizing pause, and for a moment, Daniel feared she might not answer. But then he heard the familiar sound of the door's heavy chain being undone, and the door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Turner's worried face. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore her usual apron, dusted with flour. "Daniel, what on earth?" Her eyes widened as she noticed the small, frightened girl beside him. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" She, Daniel struggled to find the words. "There was a man in the woods. He was trying to take her." Mrs. Turner's face paled. Without another word, she ushered them inside, her movements quick but gentle. Come in. Let's get you two safe." She locked the door behind them and led them to the cozy living room, where a plush couch and a warm knitted blanket seemed to beckon Lily. "Sit here, sweetie," Mrs. Turner said softly, wrapping the blanket around Lily's shoulders. The little girl looked so small and scared, her eyes darting around the room. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Daniel stood awkwardly to the side, his adrenaline still pumping. Now that they were out of immediate danger, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. His legs felt like jelly, and he sank into an armchair across from the couch, his gaze fixed on Lily. She was trembling, but she wasn't crying as much anymore. That was good, right? "Daniel," Mrs. Turner said quietly, coming to kneel beside him. Her eyes were filled with concern. "Tell me everything. What happened? Who is this little girl?" Daniel took a deep breath and recounted the entire ordeal, how he had been walking through the woods, how he'd heard the cries, and how he'd seen the man dragging Lily deeper into the forest. He told her how he had shouted at him, how the man had looked at him, and then, miraculously, run away. As he spoke, Mrs. Turner's face went through a range of emotions: shock, horror, and finally, pride. "You were so brave, Daniel," she whispered, squeezing his shoulder gently. "You saved her life." Daniel swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. Brave? He didn't feel brave. He had been terrified. His hands were still shaking, his heart still pounding. If anything, he felt like he had just stumbled through the whole thing, more lucky than heroic. But as he glanced at Lily, still huddled under the blanket, he realized something. Maybe bravery wasn't about not being scared. Maybe it was about doing the right thing, even when you were. I think we should call the police," Daniel said hesitantly, glancing up at Mrs. Turner. "That man, he might still be out there." Mrs. Turner nodded, her expression grave. "You're absolutely right. I'll call them right now." She moved quickly, grabbing the phone from the side table and dialing 911. Daniel watched as she spoke to the operator, describing the situation with a calmness that he envied. Within minutes, she hung up the phone and turned back to them. "The police are on their way," she said gently. "They'll want to talk to both of you, okay?" Lily stiffened at the mention of the police, her eyes widening with fear. No, please," she whimpered, shaking her head. "Don't let them take me. I don't want to go back." Daniel frowned, confused. "Back where?" But Lily just shook her head, burying her face in the blanket. Mrs. Turner's face softened, and she sat beside the girl, rubbing her back gently. It's okay, sweetie. No one is going to take you anywhere you don't want to go," she murmured. "The police just want to help. They'll find the bad man and make sure he can't hurt anyone else, okay?" Lily sniffled and nodded slightly, but her small body remained tense. Daniel exchanged a worried look with Mrs. Turner. Something was wrong, more than he'd realized. Who was Lily? Why had that man been after her? And why was she so afraid of the police? Before he could dwell on it any longer, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed through the front windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Lily flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around her. Mrs. Turner stood up slowly and went to the door, glancing back at Daniel. "Stay with her," she whispered. "I'll talk to the officers first." Daniel nodded, his heart pounding again. He moved to sit beside Lily, his presence a small but hopefully comforting reminder that she wasn't alone. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not after what she'd been through. The front door opened, and Daniel heard Mrs. Turner speaking quietly to the officers. He caught snippets of their conversation, words like attempted abduction and young girl. He tightened his grip on the blanket, his mind racing. He had thought the danger was over, but it was starting to feel like this was just the beginning. The officers stepped inside, their faces serious but kind. They approached slowly, their eyes gentle as they looked at Lily. "Hey there, sweetheart," one of the officers said softly, kneeling down beside the couch. "My name is Officer Harris. We're here to help you, okay? You're safe now." Lily didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he wasn't going to let them upset her. He stood up, placing himself between the officers and the couch. "Can't you just leave her alone for a bit?" he asked, his voice firmer than he felt. "She's been through enough." Officer Harris looked up at him, surprised. Then he smiled. A small, genuine smile. "Of course, son. We're not here to make things harder for her. We just want to ask a few questions, that's all." Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. The officer seemed nice enough, but still. He glanced back at Lily, who was watching him with wide, anxious eyes. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not going anywhere, okay?" he murmured. "I'll be right here." Lily swallowed and nodded, her tiny hands clutching the blanket. Daniel turned back to the officers, his shoulders squared. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was determined to see this through. He had saved Lily once. Now he had to make sure she stayed safe, for good. The police car sat in the driveway, its lights flashing softly, casting long, ominous shadows on the walls of Mrs. Turner's home. The sirens had stopped, but their echo lingered in the quiet suburban street. Daniel stood nervously near the window, his eyes flicking between the officers who had come inside and Lily, who was still curled up on the couch, clutching the knitted blanket like a lifeline. Every so often, she would glance at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust, and it made Daniel's stomach knot. Mrs. Turner had offered the officers tea, trying to create a sense of calm in the chaos, but Daniel could feel the tension in the air. Something wasn't right. Even though the police were here, there was no sense of relief, just a growing unease that he couldn't shake. Officer Harris, the kinder of the two, sat on the edge of a chair, notebook in hand. His partner, Officer Reyes, stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. It was Officer Reyes who spoke first, his voice calm but direct. "Daniel, you've done something incredibly brave today," he said, his gaze locking onto Daniel's. "But we need to know more about what happened in the woods. Every detail you can remember might help us catch the man who did this." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much the events of the day had shaken him. It was all starting to feel too real, too big for him to handle. But he nodded, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't fall apart now. Not when Lily needed him. "I was walking," Daniel began, his voice a little shaky, "just through the woods, like I always do after school. It was quiet, you know. Then I heard this sound, like crying. At first, I thought it was a dog or something, but when I got closer, I saw her, Lily, and there was this man." Officer Harris leaned in slightly, his pen hovering over the notebook. What did he look like? Can you describe him? Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, trying to bring the image back into focus. He could still see the man in his mind, the shadowy figure, his rough hands grabbing Lily, the way he had turned and stared at Daniel with those cold, dark eyes. He was tall, Daniel said slowly, maybe 6 feet. He was wearing a hoodie, dark, I think, and jeans. His face, I didn't get a good look at it, but his eyes, they were scary, like he was mad that I was there. Officer Rice finally spoke, his voice cutting in sharply. And you said he just ran off when he saw you. Daniel nodded. Yeah. I yelled at him, and he just took off. I thought he was going to come after me, but he didn't. There was a long silence as the officers exchanged a glance. Daniel's heart sank. He didn't know what they were thinking, but he could tell it wasn't good. Did he say anything to you? Officer Harris asked, breaking the silence. No, Daniel shook his head. He didn't say a word, just looked at me. And then he was gone. Another pause, and then Officer Rice uncrossed his arms and stepped forward. We need to get this little girl's story too, he said, his eyes shifting toward Lily, who had remained silent throughout the questioning. She's the key to figuring out who this guy is and what he wanted. Lily stiffened at the sound of his voice. Daniel could see her shrinking back into the couch, her small hands clutching the blanket even tighter. She looked like she was ready to bolt. I want to talk to them, Lily whispered, barely audible. Her voice was filled with a kind of terror that sent chills down Daniel's spine. I don't want to go with them. Officer Harris tried to soften his approach, kneeling down so he was at eye level with her. Lily, sweetheart, we're here to help you. No one's going to hurt you. But we need to know what happened so we can make sure the bad man doesn't hurt anyone else. Do you think you can tell us a little about him? Lily shook her head furiously, her eyes wide with panic. No, I can't. Mrs. Turner, standing nearby, stepped in to try and comfort her. Lily, honey, these officers just want to make sure you're safe. You don't have to be scared anymore. But Lily wasn't listening. She was trembling now, her breathing coming in shallow gasps. Daniel could see the sheer terror in her eyes, and it made his chest ache. He wanted to protect her, but he didn't know how. I don't want to go back, she repeated, her voice breaking. Please don't make me go back. Go back where? Daniel asked, stepping closer to her. What are you talking about? Lily looked up at him, her bottom lip quivering. She didn't answer right away, but then she whispered, to him. I don't want to go back to him. Daniel's heart dropped. He had thought Lily had just been a random victim, some innocent girl who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this was something else. She knew the man. She had been with him before. Who is he? Daniel asked softly, kneeling down beside her. Lily, who is that man? Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head again, refusing to speak. But in that moment, Daniel realized something horrible. This wasn't just about an abduction. It was about something much darker, something that had been happening for a long time. And Lily was trapped in it. Officer Rice, impatient, stepped forward again. We need answers, kid. We're not going to just sit around while this man is out there. If you know something. Daniel cut him off, his voice firm. She's scared. You can't push her like that. Ray shot him a look, clearly irritated, but before he could respond, Officer Harris raised a hand. Daniel's right. We need to be careful here. Turning back to Lily, Officer Harris spoke softly. Lily, no one is going to take you back to that man. We promise. But we need to know who he is so we can keep you safe. Lily wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, sniffling. Her gaze shifted between the officers and Daniel, as if weighing her options. Finally, she whispered 2 words that sent a chill through the room. My stepdad. The weight of those words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Mrs. Turner gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Daniel felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Her stepdad. That was the man in the woods, the one who had tried to take her. "He's not my real dad," Lily added quickly, her voice shaking. He's mean. He hits me and Mommy. And he said if I told anyone, he'd take me away, and we'd never see her again." Tears spilled down her cheeks now, and Daniel's heart ached for her. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like, living in fear every day, afraid to speak up, afraid to leave. "He was going to take me today," Lily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know where, but he said we were leaving for good. That's why I ran. I didn't want to go with him. I didn't want to leave Mommy." Officer Harris' expression turned grim. "We're going to find him, Lily, and we're going to make sure he never hurts you or your mom again. I promise." Lily nodded, but her small body was still trembling with fear. Daniel could see how broken she felt, how powerless. He wanted to reach out and hug her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he wasn't sure if it would be. Not yet. As Officer Harris called in for more backup and to issue a bulletin for Lily's stepdad, Daniel's mind was racing. This wasn't just about stopping some random abduction. This was about saving Lily from a life of fear and pain, and it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The officers left soon after, promising to keep a close eye on Lily and her mother, but the house felt heavy with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Daniel stood by the window, watching the police car disappear down the street, his heart pounding in his chest. He had saved Lily today. But what if it wasn't enough? What if her stepdad found her again? What if this nightmare never ended? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Daniel knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until Lily and her mother were safe, no matter what it took. The days following Lily's rescue were a blur of tension and anxiety for Daniel. Though he had returned to school and tried to go back to his normal routine, everything had changed. The weight of what he had uncovered, Lily's dark secret about her abusive stepfather, hung over him like a storm cloud. He had never felt so powerless, despite being the one who had saved her from the woods. Now, it seemed like the entire community was teetering on the edge, waiting for something to happen. Lily had been taken to a safe house with her mother, under police protection, but that did little to ease Daniel's mind. Every night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the thought that her stepfather was still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. The man had disappeared after the incident in the woods, and no one had been able to track him down. The uncertainty gnawed at Daniel, making him feel like the nightmare was far from over. The story had spread like wildfire throughout the town. At first, it was just whispers. The kids at school talking in hushed voices about the boy who saved a girl from being kidnapped. But soon, the details began to emerge. People were horrified to learn that Lily's abductor was not a stranger, but someone she knew, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. The shock of it rippled through the community, shaking people's trust in their neighbors. Daniel couldn't walk through the halls without people staring at him, their faces a mixture of awe and curiosity. He hated it. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted Lily to be safe. But everywhere he went, there were whispers. "That's him. The boy who stopped the abduction. I heard the guy was her stepdad. Can you believe that? Right here in our town. Do you think they'll ever find him? I don't feel safe with him on the loose." Even his teachers treated him differently now, giving him concerned looks and offering words of encouragement that only made him feel more isolated. Daniel didn't want to be special. He just wanted to forget. But forgetting wasn't an option, not when the entire town seemed to be caught up in the drama. There were neighborhood meetings where parents gathered to discuss safety, sharing paranoid theories about strangers lurking in the woods. The police patrolled more frequently, but despite their increased presence, no one could shake the feeling that something bad was coming. The tension was palpable. At the grocery store, at the park, at church, everywhere, people were on edge. Daniel overheard his parents talking late at night, their voices low and worried. His mom had been friends with Lily's mom before all of this, and now she was struggling with guilt, wondering how she had missed the signs of abuse. "I just don't understand," his mother had whispered one evening, her voice filled with pain. "How could she have kept this a secret? Why didn't she say anything? We could have helped." His father, ever the practical one, had tried to reassure her. People don't always know what to do in situations like that. They're scared. They feel trapped. But what about Lily? What she must have gone through? It's unimaginable. Daniel couldn't listen anymore. He didn't want to think about what Lily had endured, the fear she must have lived with every day. It made his chest tighten with anger and sadness. He wished he could have done more, should have done more. One afternoon, a few days after the police had questioned him, Daniel found himself back in the woods. He hadn't meant to come here. It just sort of happened. His feet had carried him to the spot where it had all begun, where he had first heard Lily's cries. The leaves crunched under his sneakers as he walked, the trees whispering softly in the breeze. It was quiet now, peaceful, but it didn't feel the same. There was a darkness to the woods that he couldn't shake, a feeling that something terrible had taken root here. As he stood in the clearing, Daniel couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. The man's face, what little he had seen of it, flashed before him, those cold, hard eyes filled with malice. Why hadn't he tried harder to stop him? Why hadn't he followed him, or gotten a better look at his face? The guilt gnawed at him, even though he knew, rationally, that he had done everything he could. But the feeling lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on him. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, and Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. He spun around, his eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see the shadowy figure of Lily's stepdad emerging from the woods. But there was nothing, just the wind moving through the leaves. Still, the fear remained. What if he's watching me? What if he's been following me all this time? Daniel shook the thoughts from his head, trying to calm himself down. He was just being paranoid. The man wouldn't come after him. He was probably long gone by now, hiding somewhere far away. But no matter how hard Daniel tried to convince himself, the fear lingered. Later that evening, Daniel sat down with his parents for dinner. The conversation was strained, as it had been for the past few days. His mom tried to talk about school, asking how his classes were going, but Daniel could tell her heart wasn't in it. She was distracted, her mind elsewhere. His dad was the same, quiet and brooding, picking at his food without much enthusiasm. They were all thinking about the same thing. Halfway through the meal, the phone rang, and his mom jumped up to answer it. Daniel watched as she spoke softly into the receiver, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. After a few minutes, she hung up and turned back to the table, her face pale. "That was Mrs. Turner," she said, her voice shaky. "She said the police found something." Daniel's stomach clenched. What? Did they catch him? His mom shook her head, sitting down heavily in her chair. No, but they found his car, abandoned on the edge of town. There were things inside, evidence that he'd been planning to leave the state. "Do they know where he is?" his dad asked, his voice tense. "No," she replied, rubbing her temples. "But they think he's still nearby. They're increasing patrols. They're doing everything they can." Daniel's mind raced. If the stepdad was still in town, that meant Lily wasn't safe. None of them were. The police might be looking for him, but he could strike at any moment. And no one would see it coming. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Daniel went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was filled with dark thoughts. What if the man came after him? What if he tried to take Lily again? The fear twisted in his gut, making it impossible to relax. He had done everything right. He had saved her. But now it felt like the nightmare was just beginning. In the days that followed, the tension in the town grew to a fever pitch. People were locking their doors at night, keeping their children close, whispering about the danger that lurked in the shadows. The local news ran stories about the ongoing search for Lily's stepdad, warning residents to stay vigilant. Daniel tried to go about his life as normally as possible, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. People watching, wondering if he knew something they didn't. He had become a symbol of the town's fear, and he hated it. One afternoon, as he walked home from school, he noticed a flyer taped to a street lamp. It was a missing persons notice, with a grainy picture of Lily's stepdad. His real name was printed in bold letters underneath the photo: Robert Harris, wanted for child abduction and domestic abuse. Daniel stared at the flyer for a long time. The man's face seared into his mind. He had never heard his name before, but now it felt like Robert Harris was haunting him. As he turned to walk away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The danger was still out there, lurking just beyond the surface. And he knew, deep down, that something terrible was coming. He just didn't know when or how. The tension in the town was now suffocating, as each passing day brought no new leads in the hunt for Robert Harris. The police had scoured the surrounding woods and abandoned properties, but found nothing. Daniel's life had been consumed by this looming threat, an ever-present fear that something terrible would happen. The town had turned into a powder keg, with rumors flying faster than facts, and everyone seemed to be bracing for an explosion. Though the town hadn't known much about Robert before the incident, the whispers and speculation began to fill in the gaps. People started talking about how he'd always seemed a little off, how there had always been something unsettling about his presence, but no one had suspected the depth of his cruelty. Now, they were all paranoid, seeing shadows where there might be none. Daniel's parents were especially on edge. His mother, once a calm and pragmatic woman, had become jumpy, locking the doors and windows the moment the sun set. His father, who used to unwind in the evenings by watching TV, now spent his time patrolling the house, checking every nook and cranny for any signs of disturbance. Daniel felt like they were living in a cage of fear, trapped by an unseen enemy. The weight of responsibility crushed him. He had saved Lily from one horror, but now there was another. He couldn't help but wonder if things would have been different had he acted sooner. Maybe Lily wouldn't have had to suffer in silence for so long. Maybe the stepfather would have been caught already. The guilt was overwhelming. At school, things weren't much better. Although he was still seen as the boy who had saved Lily, the admiration had morphed into something more complex. His classmates treated him like he was part of the drama now, not just a hero. Some kids wanted to talk to him about the event, asking morbid questions about the details. Others avoided him altogether, as if being close to him would somehow bring them closer to danger. Even teachers walked on eggshells around him, with some offering unsolicited support, as if they could sense how burdened he was. The one place Daniel had once found refuge, the place where life had seemed predictable and safe, had become a battleground of emotions. He didn't feel like himself anymore. He felt like a stranger in his own life. One afternoon, while walking home from school, Daniel's friend Marcus approached him. Marcus was one of the few people who didn't look at Daniel with pity or fear. He still treated him like the same old Daniel. They hadn't talked much since the rescue, but Marcus had been trying to reconnect, sensing that Daniel needed someone. "Hey man," Marcus said, falling into step beside him. "You good? You've been quiet lately." Daniel shrugged, staring at the sidewalk. "Just a lot going on." "Yeah, no kidding," Marcus replied, looking around as if expecting Robert Harris to jump out from behind a tree. "Everyone's talking about him. About Robert. It's like he's some ghost now." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say. How could he explain the weight he felt, the crushing guilt that had settled into his bones? He had done something brave, but it hadn't fixed anything. In some ways, it had made things worse. The town was paralyzed with fear, and he was at the center of it. "I keep thinking about that day," Daniel finally said, his voice low. I keep wondering if I could have done more, or if I could have stopped him from getting away." Marcus frowned. "Dude, you saved her. That's more than anyone else did. You can't blame yourself for what happened after." "I know," Daniel muttered, but he didn't really believe it. "It just doesn't feel like enough." They walked in silence for a few minutes before Marcus spoke again. "You ever think about going back to the woods?" The question hit Daniel like a punch. The woods, the place where everything had started. He hadn't been back since the day of the rescue. It wasn't that he was scared of the place itself, but what it represented. The memories, the fear, the unanswered questions. The woods had become a symbol of everything he was trying to avoid. "I don't know," Daniel said, hesitant. "Why would I?" Marcus shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe you'll find something, or maybe it'll help. Sometimes facing the thing you're scared of is the only way to get past it." Daniel wasn't sure what to think about that. Facing his fears. He had been living in a state of constant fear for weeks, but there was something about what Marcus said that struck a chord. The woods had taken on an almost mythical quality in his mind, a place of both danger and salvation. Maybe going back would help him find some kind of closure, or at least some peace. That night, Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The idea of returning to the woods swirled in his mind, refusing to leave. He tossed and turned, replaying the events of the day over and over. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, and none of them offered any comfort. At around midnight, unable to sleep, Daniel made a decision. He was going back to the woods. Alone. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his parents, and quietly put on his clothes. The house was dark and silent, but his heart raced with adrenaline. It felt like he was doing something forbidden, but it also felt necessary, like this was something he had to do. Once outside, the cool night air hit him, making him shiver. He took a deep breath and started walking, his feet carrying him toward the familiar path that led to the woods. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the occasional distant sound of a dog barking or a car passing by. Every shadow seemed more menacing than usual, as if the night itself was conspiring against him. When he reached the edge of the woods, Daniel hesitated. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The entrance to the forest felt like the mouth of some giant creature, waiting to swallow him whole. But Daniel wasn't going to turn back. Not now. He stepped into the woods, the crunch of leaves under his feet the only sound. The darkness was thick, but his eyes slowly adjusted as he moved deeper into the trees. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Every nerve in his body was on high alert. He half expected Robert Harris to leap out from behind a tree at any moment, but the woods were silent. The further he walked, the more the fear began to melt away, replaced by a strange sense of calm. This was where it had all happened, where he had heard Lily's cries, where he had confronted Robert, where he had made the decision that changed everything. And now it was just a place, no more and no less. As he reached the clearing where he had found Lily, Daniel stopped. The place looked different now, less menacing in the moonlight. He stood there for a long time, just taking it in. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, a movement caught his eye. A figure emerging from the trees. Daniel's heart stopped. For a brief moment, panic surged through him, his mind screaming at him to run. But then he saw who it was. "Lily," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the night. The small figure stepped into the clearing, her face pale and wide-eyed. She looked just as surprised to see him as he was to see her. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. Lily hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice soft and uncertain. I couldn't sleep. I just needed to come here." Daniel nodded, understanding. They both stood in the clearing, two figures in the dark, united by something they couldn't quite explain. The woods had become a part of them, of their story. And though they didn't have all the answers, they were here, facing it together. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of peace. Maybe things would never go back to the way they were. Maybe Robert Harris would never be caught. But in this moment, standing in the place where everything had changed, Daniel realized something important. He wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed without incident. Daniel and Lily eventually made their way back home, walking side by side in the quiet of the night. They didn't say much, but words weren't necessary. They had faced the fear together, and that was enough. The next morning, as Daniel sat at the breakfast table with his parents, he felt different, lighter somehow. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it didn't control him anymore. He had taken a step forward, and that was all that mattered. And though the town remained on edge, waiting for news of Robert Harris, Daniel knew that whatever happened next, he was ready. He had faced the woods. He had faced his fear. And in doing so, he had found something stronger: hope. As the days turned into weeks, the town of Maplewood began to return to a semblance of normalcy. While Robert Harris was still on the run, the police had intensified their search efforts, bringing in outside help and issuing public statements. His name had become synonymous with danger and fear, but the initial panic had begun to settle, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. For Daniel, however, life hadn't completely returned to normal. His late-night encounter in the woods with Lily had stayed with him, gnawing at him like an unsolved puzzle. It wasn't just the fear that lingered, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was the realization that life wasn't as simple or as safe as he had once believed. The world was more complicated, and the people in it more fragile. The townspeople, especially those close to the incident, began to shift their focus from the horror of what had happened to the strength that had emerged in its wake. The story of how a young boy had saved a little girl from being abducted had spread far beyond the borders of their small town, reaching news outlets and social media. The attention was overwhelming at first, but over time, it began to inspire others, both near and far. The town held a vigil in honor of Lily, her bravery, and Daniel's heroism. It was a somber yet uplifting event. Hundreds of people gathered in the town square, holding candles, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of hope. The mayor gave a speech, talking about community and resilience, but it was Lily's mother, Karen, who stole the night with her words. "I never thought I would stand here, in front of you all, and say these words," Karen began, her voice shaking. "My daughter, my baby girl, she was taken from me, and in that moment, I thought I had lost her forever. But then, in the darkest hour, a miracle happened. A young boy, an ordinary boy with an extraordinary heart, did something that none of us expected. He saved her." Karen's voice broke as tears filled her eyes, but she continued, "Daniel didn't just save my daughter. He saved all of us. He reminded us that even in the face of evil, there is good. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing, even when you're terrified. And for that, we will be forever grateful." The crowd erupted in applause, tears streaming down many faces, including Daniel's. Standing next to his parents, he felt both embarrassed and proud. He wasn't used to the attention, and he didn't feel like a hero. He had simply done what he thought was right. But seeing the impact it had on others, he began to realize that maybe that was what being a hero truly meant. Acting in the moment when it mattered most, even if you didn't feel prepared. As the vigil came to a close, people approached Daniel and his family, offering words of gratitude and support. They spoke about how his actions had given them hope, how they now felt safer knowing that people like Daniel existed in the world. It was humbling, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The weight of the event hadn't completely lifted, but it was no longer unbearable. In the weeks that followed, the town continued to heal, but the scars of what had happened would remain for a long time. Lily had started seeing a therapist, and while she was still quiet and withdrawn, she was beginning to open up, slowly finding her way back to a sense of normalcy. Karen had quit her job to focus on being with her daughter, realizing how precious and fleeting life could be. Daniel, too, was changing. His experience in the woods and the way it had unfolded afterward had taught him lessons he never expected to learn at his age. He had seen the best and the worst of people, the cruelty of Robert Harris, and the kindness of his community. It was a confusing mix, but it had made him grow up faster than he had ever imagined. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, watching the autumn leaves fall, Lily and her mother walked by. Karen waved and smiled, while Lily, still shy, offered a small, tentative wave. Daniel waved back, feeling a strange connection to the little girl. He knew that, in some way, they were bonded by what had happened. It wasn't a bond they had chosen, but it was one that would always be there. Marcus stopped by shortly after, kicking a stray leaf as he sat down next to Daniel on the porch steps. They hadn't talked much about the vigil or what had happened since that night in the woods, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Marcus had always been a good friend, but since the incident, he had become more like a brother, a constant source of support without ever making a big deal about it. "You hear about the new reward?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Daniel looked over, curious. "For Harris?" "Yeah, man. They upped it. Like, way up. The police are serious about catching this guy." Daniel nodded. The thought of Robert Harris still being out there bothered him. While the immediate fear had passed, there was always the possibility that he would return, that the nightmare could start all over again. But Daniel had learned to push those thoughts to the back of his mind. Worrying about the unknown wouldn't help anyone. "They'll catch him," Daniel said with quiet certainty. Marcus glanced at him. "You really think so?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know, but I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point?" They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and scattering leaves across the yard. It was a peaceful moment, but beneath the surface, Daniel knew that life would never be quite the same. Months passed, and slowly, the town of Maplewood began to rebuild its sense of safety. Robert Harris was still at large, but the intense fear had faded, replaced by a cautious optimism. Life moved on, as it always does, but the memory of what had happened remained. Daniel continued to live his life, but he wasn't the same boy he had been before the incident. He was more aware of the world around him, more attuned to the dangers that lurked in the shadows. But he was also more aware of the good, the strength of the people in his town, the kindness of strangers, and the power of community. One evening, long after the sun had set, and the stars had begun to twinkle in the night sky, Daniel's father sat him down for a talk. It wasn't unusual for his father to offer advice or words of wisdom, but this time felt different. There was a weight to his words that Daniel hadn't felt before. "You know, Daniel," his father began, "what you did, what you've been through. It's not something many people your age could handle. But you did, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you. We all are." Daniel listened, unsure of what to say. He didn't feel like a hero, and he didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. But hearing those words from his father meant more to him than he could express. "There's a lot of darkness in this world," his father continued, "but there's also a lot of light. And sometimes we have to be the ones to shine that light, even when it's hard. You've done that, son. You've made this town proud." Daniel nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. He didn't need to say anything. His father understood. As the night went on, and the world outside grew quiet, Daniel sat in his room, thinking about everything that had happened. The fear, the bravery, the pain, and the hope. It had all shaped him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. But one thing was clear. He had been given a gift. The chance to make a difference, to be a light in the darkness. And that, he realized, was enough. Reflection. In the months and years that followed, the story of Daniel's heroism would be told and retold throughout Maplewood. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable evil, good could prevail. The town had been forever changed by the events that had unfolded, but it had emerged stronger, more united. For Daniel, life went on, but he would never forget that day in the woods. It had taught him lessons about courage, fear, and the power of one person's actions. And while the memory of Robert Harris still haunted him at times, it was overshadowed by the knowledge that, in a moment of crisis, he had made the right choice. He had saved a life. And in doing so, he had changed his own life forever.